Let's get started creating our first Qwik component. I'm going to define here a constant and I'm going to give a name to our component. Let's call it simply Hello World. Now, how do we create a component? We can do so by using the Qwik component dollar function. And here is the correct import for it. The component dollar function is going to take as input a single function. This is the component rendering function. If the component has any input properties, they are going to be listed here as the props input. We are going to talk about properties later on in the course. Right now, this component here does not have any input properties, so now all we have to do is to return here the output of this function. The return that is expected for a normal Qwik rendering function is going to be a JSX node containing the view of the component. So it's a good idea to wrap the JSX node here in round parentheses so that you can break here the JSX node into multiple lines if you need to. In our case, we're going to be adding here just an H1 with some text, hello, welcome to this Qwik course. If you have never used JSX before, then you might be a little bit surprised about this syntax. So what is going on here and how does this even compile in a TypeScript program? Because this does not look like normal JavaScript. Well, if you notice here, this is actually not a plain TypeScript file. It doesn't have the .ts extension as usual. This is a .tsx file, meaning that yes, it's TypeScript, but it can also have JSX inside it. JSX is a JavaScript extension that allows you to write code that describes the view of your component in a syntax that looks a lot like HTML. But what is actually going on under the hood is that the JSX compiler is taking this expression and is converting this into DOM code. So the JSX compiler will know that it needs to create here an H1 DOM node. It will know that it needs to set the text of the node to this text here, etc. So this looks like HTML, but it's actually JavaScript. And these round parentheses here are very important because if you want to, by some reason, break up the definition of your JSX node, of the view of your application into multiple lines, as you will do in more complex components, then without these round parentheses, the JSX code would not compile. So in general, as a recommended best practice, make sure to always wrap the view of your component in round brackets to avoid this problem. Also, make sure that you only return here a single JSX node. If you try to return here multiple nodes, such as for example adding here another div, you're going to see another compilation error. More on this later on in the course. In general, always make sure that you only return a single node wrapped in round brackets and you will not get this type of errors. Now, this function here is the component rendering function, and this is going to be called by Qwik anytime that it needs to update the component. It's going to be called once when the component gets created, and then it's going to be called again as many times as necessary when the data of the component changes and the component view needs to be updated. So the rendering function is this whole function here. In order to make sure that we understand when this function is getting called, let's go ahead and let's add here some logging. Let's just say here, for example, initializing hello world component. Let's keep one thing about the rendering function in mind, which is that Qwik is a framework. So Qwik knows when to call this function. We are not expected to have to call this function ourselves. Qwik will know when to call this function for us. And with this, we have created our first component. So let's go ahead and let's try it out. I'm going to open here a terminal that on WebStorm you can open with Alt F12, and I'm going to start the development server by running the command npm start. After a moment, the server is going to be up and running here on this port. Don't worry if you see a different port or if you see a different log in your machine. Your development server is running, so you can now go ahead and open this URL here. on this port here. I'm going to switch here to a browser and I'm going to see that we get here an error. So as we can see, we are trying to access here the root of the application, which is correct, but our component is not getting rendered. So how do we fix this? We're going to go back here to our component, and in order for this component to be rendered here as the root of the application, we need to first export it so that the Qwik compiler can get access to it. Then we need to make this the default export of the file. Now I'm going to save this component using Ctrl S, and if I now go back to the browser and I reload here the application, we're going to see here the message, "Welcome to this Qwik course as expected." This environment is using hot reload, so if I go back here and I change here the view and I add here, for example, V2, I hit Command S, I go back here, and as you can see, the browser has automatically reloaded and shown here the new version of our component. And with this, we have created our first component and the development environment is confirmed to be up and running. That's great, but now if we open the console and we try to search for that console.log statement that we added here on the initialization function of our component, this one here, we're going to see that this console.log call is not shown here in the browser. And this is unlike other frameworks that you might have tried before. So what is going on here? That's what we are about to learn in our next lesson, where I'm going to talk a bit about how Qwik works under the hood. I'm going to explain how Qwik is substantially different from other frameworks that you might have seen before.